into their parts what someone else is doing, or say they have a significant amount of multi-measure rests and there's like a trumpet melody, I'll have them write, like dictate into their part the last measure they'll hear in the trumpet part or whatever, so that, and I have them try to know the other parts.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's all those examples that we've discussed. That's when we're talking about in terms of active musicianship. I had the good fortune of probably the best person I've ever heard explain this. About 5-6 years ago, we had David Maslank on our campus for about a week, and it was life-changing. And he would often talk about, in his Zen sort of way, always talk about remaining engaged. And, you have to be musically present throughout every moment. And that's always stuck with me. So whether that's through subdivision, whether that's through writing in parts, the point is you want them to remain active and plugged in during those periods of rest or long notes or whatever. Another suggestion is the met. I have no problem with using a metronome in a rehearsal. I have a problem when the metronome becomes the default. The metronome should be a tool just like any other tool that we have available to us. And there's nothing wrong with using that tool if it's helpful. Where it crosses the line, in my opinion, is when you're always using the met, and then in some ways, the ensemble is even more dependent than it would have been otherwise. The metronome can be a fantastic tool, but it is just that, it is a tool. So I would highly suggest using it judiciously and where appropriate, as opposed to a default. And this is perhaps the one that I think is the best one of all. Directing our students' ears to the motor rhythms or engines of a piece. Thinking again about getting them actively listening for the downbeats and the upbeats. That's the engine, that's the ostinato. We're playing, the Symphonic Winds is playing Blessed Are They, or Blessed Are They, depending on your point of view. And they are playing that, and one of the things that we pointed out the other day was that there's a steady quarter note pulse all the way through that. That's the engine. That's what's driving that piece. So getting their ears actively engaged to finding that engine can be a very helpful thing, without always having to say, watch me for the pulse. There are times we have to do that, no question. But there are other ways to transition them to more independent musicians by directing their ears or other strategies. Anything else anybody wants to contribute about this before we move on to intonation? I really appreciate the suggestions, particularly from those of you that are out teaching in the field right now. Any other suggestions anyone has to offer or thoughts about this?
Make sure you're a bass drum player and keep tempo.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In terms of intonation now. You can read what I have up here. I think this is the hardest thing for young teachers to do. Sometimes hard for not young teachers too. But I think this is the most challenging concept, particularly for young teachers, is to identify and be able to correct intonation. I am not a paid endorser of Dr. Jago, but if you don't have this book, I strongly encourage it. I have about 7 or 8 books about intonation and tuning, and this is the best one that I know. It is incredibly well researched. It has more physics and acoustician types of information than you probably would ever want to know. There are fingering charts for every instrument that talk about the pitch tendencies of every instrument in terms of whether or not it's normal, sharp, flat, very very flat. It has a very engaging discussion about the merits of equal temperament tuning versus just intonation and all the chords of just intonation. It is a fantastic book. Again, there are lots of others, but this is, in my opinion, the best one. So if you don't have this, this is the only thing I'm going to suggest as far as a textbook and a supplement. I think this is a fantastic resource. Some strategies. Here's the first one. I never thought about this until I actually asked the question of my students. I had, the first few years I had the A State Wind Ensemble, And by the way, I'm not saying anything I'm doing is right or wrong or vice versa, I'm just telling you what I did. I had all the pitches being generated from the tuba player. And I did concert F and A and B flat. I've done any number of things over the course of my time. But I had my principal tuba player say, we were just talking casually one day, and I said, do you really like this piece or that piece? And is it challenging, whatever? And without missing a beat, this person said, yeah, that's a challenging piece, but you know the thing that is the hardest thing for me? I said, what's that? He said, giving the concert F in the tuning cycle. And I had never thought about that before. In terms of, for some students, that could be pretty frightening. Which that's a note that should be right in the wheelhouse of particularly at the college level. And that should be no big deal. I've had oboists, same thing. I've now switched to, I have the 2 pitches being generated by the principal oboe player. So concert A, concert B flat. And again, the first time a freshman oboist or a person who's never sat in that ensemble before, because we rotate chairs frequently, and they have to, for whatever piece that they're playing first part on the oboe, first time they give that concert A, it takes them a little bit, they settle down, and they you wouldn't think that playing one of the first notes that they learn on the horn would be that panic-inducing. But for some people, it can be.
I've become a big believer in using an external drone, especially with the Indus groups.
And in fact, we're going to talk about drones here in just a little bit. Okay, but sounding that pitch, believe it or not, is a source of anxiety. So an outside reference pitch, I think, is a very good thing, whether that's a drone or a singular pitch. And I am not in any way suggesting that you should do this all the time. I'm not suggesting this. I'm simply suggesting that you can, and here's the best piece about this, manipulated with precision. There was one day that I had my doctor beat, and I gave the concert A, and I purposefully set it at 4:41. Purposefully. Just to shake things up a little bit. And they were just really, as you might expect, they were struggling because they were like, what's going on here, And then after a little while I said to them, well, by the way, gang, here's what I did. Now, obviously, horns are built to be at 440, but that slight little change that I can manipulate with that precision because I had the doctor beat, again, I'd use your phrase about raising their awareness. No question it did. Okay? That was the whole point. That was the task. That was working in this circle as far as the pedagogy. That was my goal for the day from the tuning standpoint, was to raise their awareness so they weren't just kind of lulled into the same old, same old, same old, same old. So that's a benefit that you can have with an outside reference tone where you can manipulate it just to shake things up. Now, I know there are people that advocate the tuning to 442 and other things. I don't want to get into that because, again, that's a personal preference. But I think it's fair to say that if you do have an outside reference pitch, you can every once in a while shake things up a little bit just to keep them on their toes, so to speak. And speaking of drones, I'm not a paid endorser of this either, but I find this to be a cheap, inexpensive way to really work on tuning and intonation. The cello drones for tuning and improvisation. You can find these on Spotify, iTunes. You can find them pretty easily. It's in all 12 keys, and it's essentially, in every key, it's about 6 or 7 minutes of a perfect fifth that stays perfectly in tune and in tone for the entire duration. I noticed in the band room that there was a harmony director in the band room. That if you don't have one of those, I strongly encourage that as well. That can be a very powerful way, and probably this is the sort of low rent, cheap way to get at this. But if you do have a harmony director and learn how to use that, do you have one in your personal? How has it made? I assume it's made a huge difference, or how has it changed?
I live on that thing. Yeah. It does everything. Any note, it's like, and then it goes.
Just that short though.
Well, exactly.
Be very long.
Yeah.
It's only the short but I bet it's a great resource because again, they can hear that as an external, and it's not someone in the group
Right.
who's trying to, on their own selves, play with good tones and good sounds, and then have to match to that. And so the harmony director is is a great tool. Anybody else use anything else that's?
I use a harmony director, and I use that as a drum for my tune, and it's wonderful. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
kids who are like, no, you're wrong, fix it, and I'm like, oh, cool. All right, cool. I don't have to do it. You fix it.
I do want to say one other thing about this, and I hope, I don't think I've said anything offensive yet this morning, and I hopefully this won't change that streak. But I don't necessarily have a lot of patience with, and it seems like it's mostly younger teachers or older teachers who have a medallion under their shirt and they're trying to prove something to themselves or someone else, that the only thing that they tune to is concert A, including for the brass. And I personally am not a fan of that, because as we all know, concert A for brass is, you know, for most of us, we're putting down some valves and changing the bugles. So I'm personally not a fan of that, just because it's done in the orchestral world, where it's a very appropriate, because A is an open string on all 4 strings instruments, obviously. And for woodwinds, that's a good note. But for brass, not so much. And so whether you choose, you know, and there's some people that yes or no on concert F, whatever, but where I really have a problem with this, directors that only tune to concert A because they're trying to prove something to themselves or to someone else. So whatever process works for you, that's what you should do. So here's another set of ideas here. We often think of intonation as a vertical phenomenon. We're lining everything up. We arrive at a downbeat or a cadence point, and we are like, we want to make sure everything is in tune and in tone vertically. But I want to bring up the idea that horizontal intonation is also very much a phenomenon, where when you're playing a musical line that's going this way, which they all do, unless you're playing or whatever, but they're all going this way. And so when you're doing that, interval to interval, I've known with my own college students that they like to cheat, especially half steps. That they don't play true half steps sometimes. They like, it's so close and they sort of like ramp up to it, they're like, and I'm probably exaggerating a little bit. But that's the interval that seems to be, they have the most trouble playing true, is that half step. You wouldn't think that that would necessarily be the case. I like to encourage, you know, and I know this is not new information, but maybe this slight little twist on it is, the idea of long tone exercises, Remington exercises, whatever you use that you're most comfortable with, but change it up every once in a while. It doesn't always have to be descending. Sometimes it can be ascending. And it doesn't always have to start on F or B flat. I mean, obviously you're doing that for kind of the way horns are constructed and partials and all that, we get that. But you can do the same exercise on different pitches. One of the things that I use even today are the Ray Kramer lip benders, if you're aware of those. And we do some of those most every rehearsal. And one of the things that we talk about, particularly in some of the lip bender exercises that have larger intervals, or gradually increasing the size of the interval, is playing in stair steps, as opposed to ramps, or gradually incline or declines. Actually playing stair step intervals. Make one more transfer here. Solfege, hand signals, right? That could work. Okay? Everything relates to everything. So that could be another tool in your toolbox if that helps people think about horizontal intonation as not just sort of the sine wave, but actually something that we're moving from interval to interval accurately. So, back to Mary Had a Little Lamb. This time I want you to focus on your horizontal intonation so that you're accurately moving from pitch to pitch, and we're not going to do anything funky about the tempo. Pulse.
Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb.
Awesome. You know the other thing that was an unintended consequence of that? Your all's diction / articulation was vastly improved over what it was. Okay? When you guys were just kind of thinking about the pulse, and admittedly that was a different exercise. But when you were actually thinking about, you were like, little lamb, you know? Really moving like that. Awesome, that's good, right? That's awesome. So the point is, singing is a very good thing in the band rehearsal. We frequently sing in the band rehearsal, and not just, scales or things like that, but whether that's chorales, whether that's, whatever piece we're playing, we sing. Not all the time. It's another tool. It's another tool. And there are some people that, I think are, closet choir directors perhaps, in their real motivation, and the band ends up singing more than they do playing. And then, again, they're trying to prove a point to themselves or someone else. Singing is a tool, just like any other thing in our toolbox. We should use it, we should employ it when appropriate, but it's not a crutch. Okay. Some other thoughts? When I was a young director, I felt like, and even now to a certain extent, I have a little more experience, I hope, I felt like I had to do it right now, immediately. Set reasonable goals and timelines. For example, just my opinion, you can't tune an out-of-tone sound. Think about the word intonation. In tune, in tone, intonation. We've all had that experience, or maybe seen that experience, where you've had someone that has just a horrendous tone. And they're like, but I stopped the needle. You sound like an endangered species. That's not what we want to have. Okay? You got to have a good characteristic tone first, right? And I will say this, and I am not. I know there are people that our clarinet professor at A-State talks about people that geek out about their equipment, and I know there are people that have like just unnaturally long conversations about the merits of mouthpiece diameter and cup and shank and this reed or that. I am not in any way saying that those are bad discussions, but I will say this. There are obviously times where equipment choices contribute to this. Obviously, we all know that. And so if there's a way to make sure that the best equipment is available to our students, that will help. Another thought. We all want to have our ensembles play in tune, but we sort of throw this out as kind of a macro, blanket type of statement. Why not be specific about it? When I started doing this, it made a big difference, not only for me and my own psyche, in the sense that I felt like I was being effective as a music educator because I had a specified goal, and I could assess that goal, and we're like, yes, we are making progress. Good, thank you. It wasn't just, we're all going to play in tune all the time. So perhaps this is a suggestion. Unisons, octaves, cadence points, upper woodwind intonation, whatever you define as the goal. Having it be something that's specific, that you can measure, that you can assess, and I know those are capital E education words, but they're relevant. Something that you can use as a, yes, we're making progress towards this. And that's especially helpful for young music teachers. And you feel like you're just sort of overwhelmed by everything. Have a specific goal as far as this month, we're going to work on X. And work on that goal, longitude. And then finally, with this particular point, if it doesn't work the first time, try something else. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. It's okay to try something else. That's why you have the toolbox, hopefully, so that you're able to get another tool if for whatever reason this particular tool isn't functioning the way you need it to. Don't be afraid to try something else. Here's some other thoughts regarding intonation. Intonation is not a visual skill. That is perhaps a component if you're looking at a reference or looking at a tuner or something like that. But it is an aural skill, and I say an intellectual skill as well. There are just some things you got to know. You got to know that every time you use 1 and 3 on the trumpet, or 1, 2, and 3, that it's going to be incredibly sharp. You got to know that. If at some point you feel comfortable enough to introduce the idea of just intonation to your ensembles, hopefully they know, hey, when we're in the third of this chord, we have to do this or that. there's an intellectual quality to it as well, and or academic, if you want to use that word, not just a needle. I actually took away the tuners in my ensemble, except for the oboe. That was the reference. I took away the tuners. Because what was happening is they were all watching and they weren't listening. Now, am I saying in any way that you should not use tuners? I am not saying that. All I am saying is people can become too dependent on it, just like any other tool in the toolbox. So using it to help rather than to create a dependence as needed. Specific instructions. I hear this frequently when I go and do clinics. People will say things like, listen, but there's not a follow-up to listen to what? Listen to whom? Listen to specifically what information are you trying to get me to match? It's just a listen. Now, you can say that with a professional ensemble or a collegiate ensemble perhaps. You can say things like that. You can't say things like that to a beginning band or a young band because they won't know. I see all the chief, yes, that is correct. They won't know. You have to teach them this is to whom you are going to listen and to how, directing their ears. You can't just say, listen. And then, oh, by the way, when they're listening to match pitch, now some instruments, as we know, can't match their pitch or can't alter their pitch easily, or maybe not at all. So there are times when we maybe perhaps want to tune to the piano. Yeah, you can tune the piano, but not every day, and certainly not that moment. Percussion, same thing. You've got to match the percussion in some sort of way. They can't adjust their pitch very easily at all. So just being aware of that. And finally, same thing I said with the metronome, same thing on the tuner. I think using it as a tool, I think it's a great tool. I think you should use the tool. But if it's all the time, every day, we're always looking for where the needle stops. By the way, many of you probably have seen